Jerome Powell, the honorable central banker, was asked recently, do you believe that inflation was caused by the Russia invasion of Ukraine? And he, to his credit, said, no, inflation was already pretty high before Russia invaded Ukraine. And then the politician who asked him said, well, why the hell does the president keep saying that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is leading to inflation? Is this an important kind of data point in that now the central bankers, not only are they saying it's not transitory, but they're being honest is like kind of a weird word, but they're at least being more transparent about what they really think are the drivers of inflation, and they're not just going with the talking points of any one political party?
Yeah, 100%, man. So I feel bad for Jerome Powell, really any Fed chair that has to sit in front of our dysfunctional Congress and listen to what I believe are the dumbest series of questions out there. I mean, by Jove. But anyway, so yeah, this whole inflation, what's causing inflation, is very clearly a political football in DC. And the reason it's a political football is because we're heading into a midterm elections where I'm pretty sure the Democrats are very clearly going to get smoked as a function of the inflation, the stock market crash, et cetera, et cetera. That's a perfect recipe for losing the majority in the House and Senate. With respect to Powell and this inflation narrative, he is being accurate. And this is something we've been talking about on your program all year, which is the broadening out of inflation pressure. You know, there's a couple statistics I'll throw at the audience, which is the median CPI, the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland maintains a statistic that shows the median price change across all the different hundreds of items in the CPI basket. And on a median basis, it's up 6.4% on a 3-month annualized rate of change basis, which is the fastest rate of all time in the time series going back to the early 80s. So we do have a problem with inflation and it's broadening out. And then with respect to this whole Russia-Ukraine nonsense, and let's put this to bed, or at least put it to bed from the side of our audience, inflation was at 7.5% in January of 2022 before Russia crossed the border and stepped foot into Ukraine. 2, when you look at what's actually driving inflation now at this particular juncture, it's now services inflation. Core services inflation at 7.8% on a 3-month annualized basis. That's the fastest number we've seen since the mid-90s. Or sorry, not the mid-90s, the middle of 1990. And so clearly it's, these are things that have very little to do with, rising food and energy prices. If you talk about, the how much it costs to rent your home or get on an airplane or go rent a hotel room.
So another component of this is that he was asked, do you believe that the United States is potentially headed towards a recession? And he basically said yes, which goes directly against the White House press secretary saying they do not see a recession being imminent. Janet Yellen saying she does not see a recession imminent. And it feels to a degree that Jerome Powell is kind of breaking ranks. He's being a little bit more honest, a little bit more rational, intellectually humble even maybe to some degree. How do you start to analyze if a central banker is doing that? Is he signaling that it may be way worse than people are thinking it could get? Or is he just trying to keep his own personal credibility so that when he leaves as the Fed Reserve chairman, he's got other opportunities, from his kind of professional career?
No, a great question, man. And there's a couple things I'll unpack towards the end of this. But the one thing I will say is that he's actually not breaking ranks. Don't forget, I'm going to say last month, he, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and President Biden huddled up together in the Oval Office to decide what would be the sort of plan to tackle inflation. And more importantly, I'm assuming what was also going to be their communication strategy. And clearly the communication strategy is, from Yellen's perspective, hey, we got this wrong, we're doing something about it. From President Biden's perspective, it's all Vladimir Putin and the Fed's got to do something about it. And Jay Powell is willingly understanding that he's got the full weight of the credibility of the Federal Reserve institution behind him, is effectively taking responsibility, being sort of the scapegoat and ultimately having to be the bad cop as it relates to getting inflation under control. I sent you a chart. It might be a little bit too wonky for this program, but I tend to think that everyone has the ability to learn and grow. So can you throw up that chart? Powell still fighting to maintain control over the bond market. Do you have that one?
Yeah, the last one you sent us. Yeah. Powell is fighting to maintain control over the bond market. What is this showing us?
Yeah, so the second panel, the bottom chart is the more relevant one for this discussion, which shows the term premium in Treasury bonds. So that's a very wonky specific statistic. But in layman's terms, what it means is how much sort of extra yield do bond investors need to get compensated for to take the risk of just owning a bond, because there's all sorts of different volatility with growth expectations, different volatility with inflation expectations, policy rate expectations, et cetera, et cetera. And right now, that term premium is a minus 6 basis points. You go back to the last time we had the Fed lose its credibility in the mid to late 70s, all the way into the early 80s until Paul Volcker started to get it back. You saw that statistic go all the way up, 400 or 500 basis points. And so right now, what this is telling you is that the bond market still believes the Fed is going to do something significant to get inflation under control, which is why Powell feels comfortable being the bad cop. It'll be a lot more difficult for him to be the bad cop if we were at much higher levels on this chart. I mean, at minus 6 basis points, that's an 8th percentile reading since going back to the late 1950s. So he's got a decent amount of credibility. He's got a window to use it. Now, if this window closes and we don't get inflation under control before the economy slows down significantly, then he's going to start losing a significant amount of credibility. And that could be all hell could be breaking loose in the bond market.
So if we go and we take a look at the topping process, you said topping process is market-based inflation expectations. Help people understand what a topping process is and then how that relates to these inflation expectations.
Yeah, great question, Pop. So topping processes. So tops are generally processes, right? Like if you look at a chart of a stock, you should look at a chart of Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin tends to have these blow off tops. It'll eventually mature as an asset class, but you can look at a chart of the stock market as an instance. They tend to sort of crest into the peak. And when you look at market internals, you tend to sort of lose leadership along the way into the peak. And it's usually this sort of very observed, very measured process, whereas bottoms are usually catalyzed by some sort of cathartic event and eventually some sort of, very aggressive policy response to get you going in the other direction. So what I'm showing in this chart here is 2-year, 5-year, 10-year, and 30-year inflation swap rates. This is what the bond market is betting inflation is going to be over the average of those durations. And so clearly the bond market is saying, hey, look, we are no longer comfortable pricing inflation expectations up and to the right off the top of the chart anymore. Clearly inflation on a reported basis is up and to the right off the top of the chart. But the forward-looking, sort of market, going back to our discussion on how markets are forward-looking, the bond market is starting to say, hey, I think we're starting to peak out in inflation expectations terms, which takes me to, sort of this next part of the discussion, which you were talking about prior to me joining the program, which is this eventual transition to deflation. Deflation, going back to, been in the program for a while now, but for those of you who are new, we run a sophisticated sort of systematic regime segmentation process at 42 Macro to help investors manage macro risk. And one of those regimes is called deflation. That's where both growth and inflation are slowing it simultaneously. That's, generally speaking, it's a lot of what you've seen on your screens year to date. Could be a little bit worse for certain asset classes, but also a little bit better if you think about bonds, potentially starting to rally, but very bad for things like physical commodities, et cetera, and digital commodities, et cetera. And so maybe this is a leading indicator of that sort of eventual transition to deflation, which we must go through in order to get to the good stuff, get back to the good times.